I knew something was wrong before I even pulled into the driveway, because from half a block away, I could see sunlight where there wasn't oppos. T supposed to be sunlight. Now, when you and oppos, VE lived in the same house for 40 years, you notice little things like that. The angle of shadows, the shape of a roof line, the way your porch catches the evening light. And when I turned onto Alder Creek Road that Sunday evening and saw open sky sitting behind my house where my workshop should and oppos, VE been, I just froze there behind the wheel like my brain refused to process it. I remember my hand still resting on the turn signal, blinking, while I stared at this empty patch of dirt where 22 years of my life used to stand. My name in oppos, S. Walter Grady, I and oppos, am 71 years old, retired cabinet maker, born and raised outside of Pine Hollow, Montana. And that workshop they tore down wasn't oppos. T some junk shed full of rusty lawn chairs and beer cans either. That place was my whole world. I built it myself back in 2002 after my wife Claire beat breast cancer the first time. We didn't end oppos. T have much money, but she told me, and quote, Walt, if you and oppos, re gonna grow old, at least give yourself a place to keep your hands busy, end quote. So I did. Every board in that shop had a memory attached to it. The old cedar shelves came from a barn my father built in the 60s. The windows were salvaged from the elementary school they tore down after the flood. Hell, even the coffee stains on the workbench had history. And inside that shop, man, inside that shop was everything I cared about that still made sense after Claire passed. 200 hand tools, most older than my son. Half-finished rocking horses for my granddaughters. A walnut dining table I and oppos, D-bin building for my youngest daughter and oppos, S anniversary. And sitting in the corner, right where it had sat for almost 30 years, was my father and oppos. S 1948 Delta bandsaw, cast iron body, weighs damn near as much as a motorcycle. My old man taught me how to use that thing when I was 12 years old. He and oppos, D stand behind me with one hand on my shoulder and say, and quote, easy now? Wouldn't oppos, LL tell you where it wants to go if you stop forcing it, end quote. Funny thing is, I still hear his voice every time I cut a curve. Or, I used to. Because by the time I got home that Sunday, all of it was gone. Not damaged. Not broken into. Gone. Hauled off like trash. There were bulldozer tracks across my yard, splintered plywood buried in the mud, insulation blowing through the grass like tumbleweeds. And taped to my mailbox was this bright orange notice from the HOA. Citation for non-compliant structure removal. $15,000 due immediately. Another $8,400 for property cleanup and landscaping restoration. I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes your brain just breaks for a second when something in oppos is too insane to accept. I kept waiting for somebody to come out yelling and quote, gotcha, and quote, like it was some reality show prank. Nobody came. Just wind moving through the trees where my shop used to stand. I barely slept that night. Sat in my kitchen drinking burnt coffee till almost sunrise, staring out the window at that empty dirt patch. Around 6 in the morning, I finally called the number listed on the notice. Woman answers all cheerful like she and oppos, S working customer service at Disneyland. Transfers me over to the HOA president. His name was Ethan Carlisle. 42 years old, startup money, moved into Pine Hollow 2 years earlier after selling some software company in Seattle. Big modern glass house up on the ridge. Drove one of those electric trucks that looks like a kitchen appliance. Soon as he got on the phone, I could already hear it in his voice, that polished kind of arrogance rich people get when nobody and oppos S told them no in a while. He says, and quote, Mr. Grady, your detached structure violated updated architectural compliance standards approved by the board last spring, end quote. I said, end quote, you tore down my building while I was out of town, end quote. And this guy actually sighs like I and oppos, and the inconvenience here. Then he says, end quote, frankly, Walter, Pine Hollow is evolving. Residents Don and oppos, do you want to look at some backwoods scrapyard every time property values come up? End quote. Backwoods scrapyard. That and oppos, that's what he called my workshop. Then came the line I still think about sometimes. He chuckled, actually chuckled, and said, end quote, maybe it and oppos. It's time to sell the old tools and join the modern world, end quote. And right there, standing barefoot in my kitchen holding that phone, something inside me shifted cold. Not anger exactly. Anger burns hot. This felt different. Quiet. Like a door closing. Because here in Apos. The thing Ethan Carlisle didn't and Apos. Know. That workshop sat on land my grandfather bought in 1954, long before Pine Hollow had wine bars, yoga studios, and HOA newsletters printed on recycled paper. And that night, after that phone call, I pulled an old metal lockbox from my closet, spread 30 years of property records across my kitchen table, and found something Ethan Carlisle probably wishes I and Apos never seen. I must and Apos. VE sat at that kitchen table till nearly 2 in the morning, glasses halfway down my nose. Old survey maps spread out under a yellow lamp Claire bought me from an antique store back in and Apos, 98. Outside, the yard still looked like a crime scene. Dirt torn open, tire tracks frozen in the mud, scraps of insulation caught in my fence wire like dead birds. Every once in a while I and Apos glance out the window and feel that hollow punch all over again. But somewhere between the county parcel map and the HOA incorporation papers, something started feeling off. See, I and Apos. VE worked construction most of my life. You spend 50 years reading blueprints, setbacks, property lines, your eyes catch things. Little inconsistencies. Tiny lies hiding inside paperwork. And there it was. One thin red line on the HOA expansion survey from 2018 didn't and Apos matched the original county boundary records from the 70s. At first I figured maybe I was tired. Maybe grief was making me paranoid. So I drove down to the county records office first thing Tuesday morning, carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. The woman behind the counter recognized me immediately. Small town. Everybody knows everybody eventually. She says, and quote, "Walter, honey, what happened to your workshop?" End quote. And I remember just standing there for a second trying not to let my voice crack. I said, end quote, "That and Apos. What I and Apos am here to figure out." End quote. 3 hours later, after digging through annexation filings and easement maps, we found it. Or more accurately, we found what wasn't and Apos there. No signed consent form from me. No legal boundary transfer. No county-approved annexation record for my parcel. Nothing. Ethan Carlisle and Apos. HOA had drawn my land into their jurisdiction on paper without ever legally acquiring authority over it. Which meant for almost 5 years, they and Apos been fining me, inspecting my property, sending violation notices, and eventually bulldozing my workshop, without any legal power to do any of it. I remember the clerk slowly leaning back in her chair and whispering, end quote, "Oh, that and Apos. Bad." End quote. Bad didn't and Apos even begin to cover it. I left there and drove straight to Bill Mercer downtown. Bill and Apos, a real estate attorney about my age, suspenders, coffee breath, office smells like old books, and pipe tobacco. 20 years ago, I built a cherrywood crib for his daughter when she was born. Soon as I walked in carrying those records, he says, end quote, "Walt, you look like hell." End quote. I said, end quote, "Probably because somebody demolished my life over the weekend." End quote. He stopped smiling after that. We spread everything across his conference table, and for about 6 straight minutes he didn't and Apos say a word. Just reading, flipping pages, adjusting his glasses. Then all of a sudden he leans back and starts laughing so hard he has to wipe tears out of his eyes. Not because it was funny. Lawyer laughter and Apos different. That and Apos predator laughter. He points at the annexation filing and says, end quote, "Walter, these idiots committed fraud." End quote. Turns out Ethan and the HOA board had rushed a neighborhood expansion back in 2019 because property values around my side of Pine Hollow were climbing fast. More homes under HOA control meant more dues, more authority, more leverage with developers. But instead of getting proper consent from every landowner, they apparently assumed nobody would check the paperwork too closely. And honestly, they were probably right. Most folks just pay fines to avoid headaches. Most folks Don and Apos spend 40 years measuring lumber down to a 1/16 of an inch. Bill filed the lawsuit Wednesday morning. Trespassing, destruction of private property, theft, unlawful governance, fraudulent enforcement practices. Total damages just over $68,000 once we calculated equipment loss, emotional distress, demolition costs, and historical tool valuation. But the money wasn't in Apos. Even the real problem anymore. The real problem was what discovery would uncover once county investigators got involved. Because if my annexation had been illegal, there was a good chance mine wasn't and Oppo's, the only one. Bill requested the HOA membership records that same afternoon. By Friday, we had names. 43 additional households added during the 2019 expansion. And out of those 43, 29 had incomplete legal consent records. 7 had no consent records at all. Ethan Carlisle didn't and Oppo's, just target me. He and Oppo's, built half his HOA empire on paperwork shortcuts and intimidation. That and Oppo's, that's when things got ugly. Bill drafted this 12-page packet explaining the annexation violations in plain English, included copies of the county findings, and mailed it to every affected homeowner. We figured maybe a handful would respond. Maybe 5 or 6 angry retirees looking for refunds. We were wrong. Real wrong. My phone started ringing 2 days later and basically didn't and Oppo's. Stopped for weeks. One family had paid almost $18,000 in HOA fines over landscaping violations. Another elderly couple got threatened with liens because they installed a wheelchair ramp without, architectural approval, A widowed schoolteacher named Denise Harper cried on the phone telling me she and Oppo's, skipped medication payments 1 month to cover HOA penalties because Ethan convinced her they could seize her property. People were furious, but more than that, they were embarrassed. Nobody likes realizing they and Oppo's, been bullied for years by somebody bluffing authority they never legally had. Meanwhile, Ethan went into full damage control mode. HOA newsletters started appearing in mailboxes calling me, a disruptive influence resistant to community progress, They accused me of spreading misinformation. One board member, this smug little guy named Trevor who wore sweater vests year-round like he was auditioning to become mayonnaise, actually came onto my property with a clipboard trying to photograph additional violations, I told him if he stepped 1 foot closer I and Oppo's, introduce him to Montana gravel personally. Funny enough, he left pretty quick after that. But beneath all the HOA posturing, panic was setting in fast. By week 3, 3 board members resigned. HOA legal fees crossed $200,000. Their insurance company refused coverage once fraud allegations entered the case. And then came the phone call. Thursday evening, around dinner time. Ethan himself. First time he and Oppo's, sounded human since this whole thing started. His voice was shaky, tired. Like somebody hadn't and Oppo's, slept in days. He says, Walter, this has gotten out of hand. I nearly laughed hearing that. Out of hand. Like he was talking about a backyard barbecue instead of illegally terrorizing an entire neighborhood. I said, funny. That and Oppo's. That's exactly what I thought standing in my backyard looking at my workshop foundation, Silence. Then he lowers his voice and says, What do you want? And here and Oppo's. That's the truth. Until that moment, I hadn't and Oppo's, fully known myself. Because at first I wanted revenge. Then I wanted justice. But sitting there hearing this wealthy little control freak suddenly scared for the first time in his life, I realized what I really wanted was for people like Ethan Carlisle to stop mistaking money for ownership over other human beings. So I told him, calm as could be, I want every family you pushed around to get their money back, He exhales hard into the phone. Says, that and Oppo's. That's impossible, And I said, no, Ethan. What an Oppo's. That's impossible is rebuilding 22 years of memories after somebody bulldozes them while you and Oppo's out buying groceries, He tried offering me a private settlement after that. $80,000 cash if I and Oppo's, withdraw the lawsuit quietly. Bill didn't and Oppo's, even let me answer before saying absolutely not. Because by then this thing had grown way bigger than my workshop. County investigators were involved. Local news stations picked up the story. People started digging into old HOA meeting recordings online, finding clips of Ethan mocking longtime residents for being, visually outdated, One video actually caught him joking that Pine Hollow needed fewer, country grandpas with junk piles, if the town wanted to attract tech investment. That clip spread everywhere. And the more pressure built, the uglier Ethan became behind closed doors. A week later, somebody spray-painted "Traitor" across my garage door in red paint. My mailbox got smashed with a baseball bat. One night around midnight, I caught headlights sitting outside my house for nearly 20 minutes before peeling off down the road. Bill wanted police reports filed for everything. Me, honestly, I think part of me stopped feeling afraid the day I saw that empty dirt patch where my workshop used to stand. Once somebody takes the thing you love most, fear loses a lot of leverage. Still, I wanted Oppos. T lied to you. There were nights I sat alone in that quiet house wondering if maybe I and Oppos D pushed things too far. Claire used to say bitterness can sneak into a man and Oppos' soul wearing the clothes of righteousness. And sometimes, laying awake listening to coyotes out past the tree line, I wondered if she was right. Then I and Oppos D remember Ethan laughing about my father and Oppos' tools, and sleep came easier after that. By the second month, Pine Hollow barely felt like the same town anymore. Folks who hadn't and Oppos T spoken in years were standing in little circles outside the diner comparing HOA fines like war stories. You and Oppos D hear things like, and quote, they charged me $600 for leaving my camper parked 2 days too long, and quote, and somebody else would answer, and quote, hell, they threatened me over wind chimes, and quote. It stopped being about landscaping violations pretty quick. People realized the HOA had been operating less like a neighborhood association and more like a private government nobody actually voted into power. And once that kind of realization gets loose in a small town, it spreads fast. Ethan tried holding a public meeting at the clubhouse to calm everybody down. That turned into a disaster almost immediately. I went mostly because Bill told me I should, and quote, observe the atmosphere, and quote, which is lawyer talk for go watch the ship sink. Place was packed shoulder to shoulder. Angry homeowners, local reporters, even county officials standing in the back with notepads. Ethan walked in wearing this expensive navy sweater, trying hard to project confidence. But the second people saw him, the room started boiling. One woman yelled, and quote, you stole from us, and quote. Another guy shouted, and quote, you threatened to foreclose on my house over weeds, and quote. Ethan kept raising his hands saying, and quote, please, let an Oppos stay civil, and quote. But nobody wanted polished corporate language anymore. They wanted blood. Then Denise Harper stood up. Same widow who skipped medication payments because of HOA fines. Tiny little woman, Kuden and Oppos. T weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet. She looked Ethan dead in the eye and said, voice shaking, and quote, you made me feel poor in my own home, and quote. Man, you couldn't Oppos. VE heard a pin drop after that. Because suddenly this wasn't Oppos T paperwork anymore. It wasn't Oppos T surveys or annexation law or property codes. It was humiliation. Years of ordinary people getting treated like tenants on land they and Oppos D worked their whole lives to own. Ethan looked genuinely rattled for the first time. He starts talking about maintaining community standards, protecting property values, preserving neighborhood image, and this old rancher named Curtis Bell cuts him off with the line everybody in town still repeats. He says, and quote, son, a community ein and Oppos, T flower beds and matching fences. It and Oppos, S people, end quote. Whole room erupted after that. Meeting ended 20 minutes later when somebody threw a binder at the HOA board table. Didn't and Oppos T hit anybody, but emotionally, I think it hit Ethan pretty hard. 3 days after that meeting, the judge ordered mandatory mediation. By then, 47 families had active claims tied to the lawsuit. Total estimated damages were pushing close to $1 million once refund demands and legal exposure got calculated. Bill told me the HOA and Oppos' attorneys looked exhausted walking into mediation, like men trying to plug bullet holes with chewing gum. Ethan was there too. Didn't and Oppos T even look like the same guy anymore. The arrogance was gone. He had dark circles under his eyes, beard growing and uneven, shoulders slumped forward like somebody carrying invisible weight. Funny thing is, seeing him like that didn't and Oppos T feel nearly as satisfying as I and Oppos D imagined. Maybe because once somebody and Oppos S truly broken, anger starts turning into something sadder. We sat across from each other for almost 6 hours while lawyers argued numbers and liability. Around the 5th hour, Ethan finally asked if he could speak to me privately. Bill hated the idea, but I agreed. We stepped outside onto this little courthouse balcony overlooking downtown Pine Hollow. Snow was starting to fall. Then finally he goes, and quote, "You know, I really thought I was helping this town." End quote. I remember studying him for a second, trying to decide whether I believed him. And honestly, I think part of him meant it. Guys like Ethan, Don, and Apos, usually wake up planning to become villains. They convince themselves control equals improvement. That if everything looks cleaner, wealthier, more modern, then life automatically gets better. Problem is, eventually people become obstacles to the image instead of the reason for it. I asked him, end quote, "Did you ever once step inside my workshop before you destroyed it?" End quote. He didn't, and Apos, answer. Just stared out at the snow. And right there, I understood the whole thing. Ethan never saw my workshop as a place where a grandfather carved toy boats for his grandkids, or where an old widower still talked to his dead wife while sanding cedar at midnight. To him, it was just visual clutter standing in the way of some magazine version future he wanted to sell. That, and Apos, the danger with power, I guess. The farther removed you get from ordinary people, the easier it becomes to erase pieces of their lives without feeling the weight of it. Mediation failed the next morning. Honestly, I think everybody knew it would. 2 weeks later, the court ruled in our favor almost across the board. HOA authority revoked permanently. Full dissolution ordered under state oversight. Mandatory reimbursement of improperly collected fees dating back to 2019. Total financial damage landed somewhere around $930,000 by the end. Ethan and Apos' HOA collapsed before summer even started. The clubhouse got sold to the county. The board disappeared overnight. Ethan himself quietly listed his house and moved out before winter. Last I heard, he took a massive loss on the sale. And me? Well, 6 months after all that madness, my grandson Caleb and I poured fresh concrete right where the old workshop used to stand. Bigger foundation this time. Stronger beams too. Caleb comes over every Saturday wearing those oversized work gloves kids always think make them look tougher. Sometimes we work in silence. Sometimes he asks about Claire or my father or how things used to be before Pine Hollow got crowded with people trying to reinvent it. A few weeks ago, we finally moved my father and Apos' bandsaw back into place. Turns out the demolition company never actually destroyed it. One of the workers recognized it was valuable and refused to scrap it. Needed repairs, but not dead. Kinda poetic, honestly. Old things survive more than people expect if they and Apos rebuilt right to begin with. And here and Apos, the part that and Apos, probably make some folks mad. After the HOA dissolved, property values in Pine Hollow actually went up 7% in under a year. Turns out people like freedom a whole lot more than matching mailbox colors. Now listen, I and Apos am not saying every HOA is evil. Some neighborhoods need rules. Some people really will park 6 broken trucks on their lawn and call it landscaping. But there and Apos, a line between maintaining a community and controlling one. And once people with money and authority forget that line exists, eventually somebody pushes back. In my case, it just happened to be a 71-year-old carpenter with too many old documents and not much left to lose. So tell me something. If somebody bulldozed a piece of your life and called it progress, would you fight back or walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because trust me, after this whole mess, I learned real fast that everybody and Apos' definition of justice looks a little different once it and Apos' their home on the line.